My sister sold our father's company out from under me. 11 years later, I own the building she rents. Here is a thing nobody warns you about grief. It leaves a door open, and other people walk through it. The morning my sister Paula walked through mine, I was standing in the machine shop my father built in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, wiping cutting oil off a Bridgeport mill with a rag I'd cut from one of his old flannel shirts, because that was the kind of frugal that got passed down in our family like a nose or a temper. Dad had been gone 11 weeks. The shop still smelled like him, like coolant and coffee left too long on the burner, and the WD-40 he sprayed on everything, including once, memorably, a squeaky kitchen chair that then dripped oil on my mother's linoleum for a month. I had his reading glasses in my shirt pocket. I don't know why I carried them. They didn't fit my face, and I didn't need them yet, but I couldn't leave them in a drawer to be forgotten, so they rode around against my chest like a small, stubborn animal. Paula came in wearing a camel coat that cost more than the mill's monthly electric bill, and she didn't wipe her feet, and she said before hello, before anything, "We need to talk about Fletcher Precision, Gwen. It can't stay the way it is." I was 43 years old. I had been a machinist on that floor for 19 of them. And I understood, the way you understand a cut is deep before it starts to hurt, that my sister had not come to grieve. What she wanted, it turned out, was the whole company. Not a share of it, not a seat at the table, the whole thing. The 5,100 square feet on Roosevelt Avenue, the 11 employees, the client list, the name over the door that was our name. She wanted to sell it to a roll-up outfit out of Boston called Meridian Industrial that bought small shops, stripped the receivables, moved the good machines to a facility in North Carolina, and let the rest die quietly of neglect. She had already, she informed me, spoken to them. She had already, she informed me, started the process. I asked her how she thought she could do that. It was a genuine question. I wasn't being clever. And Paula, who was 2 years older than me and had spent those 2 years believing they entitled her to arrange my life, looked at me the way you look at a slow child, and she said, "Because I'm the executor, Gwen. Dad's will names me. You should have read it." The thing about being betrayed by the person who was supposed to protect you is that it doesn't announce itself. There's no music. Paula and I had shared a bedroom on Cottage Street until I was 14. She taught me to ride a bike by running alongside me down the block and lying about when she'd let go. When our mother died, I was 26, Paula 28, it was Paula who handled the funeral home, Paula who wrote the thank you cards, Paula who sat with me in the parking lot of Swan Point Cemetery while I fell apart in a Honda Civic. I had loved her the uncomplicated way you love someone who has always been slightly ahead of you, showing you which rooms were safe. So when she stood in our father's shop and told me the will made her executor, I believed her. That was the first mistake, and it was a big one. And I want to be honest about it, because the version of this where I saw it all coming would be a lie, and lies are exactly what got me into it. She had the will. She had a lawyer in Providence, a slick one named Douglas Reyes, who wore French cuffs to a meeting about a machine shop. And she had, God help me, momentum. The momentum of someone who had already decided, who had already signed things, who spoke in the flat institutional register of a woman reading terms and conditions aloud. When I pushed back, she didn't raise her voice. She said, "I know this is emotional for you. I'm trying to do the responsible thing." When I said the 11 people on that floor had families, she said, "Meridian has a very generous severance policy." When I said Dad would never have wanted the shop sold, she said, "Dad also never wanted to talk about money, and look where that left us." Nothing personal, she kept saying. It's nothing personal. It's just what makes sense. I have thought about that phrase for 11 years. Nothing personal. As if she could reach into a thing made entirely of our father's 40 years of work and our shared childhood and extract from it something impersonal, like pulling a bone out of a fish. The wreckage came fast, because that is how wreckage comes. Within 6 weeks, the sale to Meridian closed. Paula, as executor, had authority I didn't understand and couldn't afford to fight. I'd priced a lawyer of my own and gotten quoted a retainer of $8,000 just to review the estate documents, which was roughly $8,000 more than I had, because a machinist's salary of $54,000 a year does not leave a person with cushions. The sale price was $890,000 for the whole operation, land included, which even I could tell was low, and Paula's cut as executor and majority beneficiary was the lion's share of it, and my share was a check for $91,000 that arrived in a windowed envelope like a phone bill. I didn't cash it for 2 months. It sat on my kitchen counter under a bowl of clementines going soft, and every morning I looked at it, and every morning I felt like the most expensive thing in my father's life had been converted into a number and mailed to me. Meridian did exactly what those outfits do. They kept 4 of the 11. The good machines. The Mazak lathe Dad had bought used in 2009 and babied like a firstborn. The Haas VF2, the surface grinder, went on a flatbed to North Carolina in March. I stood across Roosevelt Avenue in the cold with a cup of Dunkin' going cold in my hand and watched them wheel the Mazak up the ramp. And I thought about all the parts that machine had made, the aerospace fittings and the medical brackets, and the one weird prototype for a guy who was sure he'd invented a better mousetrap. And I did not make a sound, because there was no sound that would have been the right size for it. I just stood there until the truck pulled out and the brake lights disappeared toward 95, and then I went home. The name came down in April. They power washed Fletcher Precision off the brick, and for a while you could still read the ghost of it, cleaner brick where the letters had shielded the surface from 30 years of exhaust. Then they painted the whole wall gray. Here is who vanished. The men Dad golfed with, who'd called the house for years, stopped calling. Our cousin Denise, who'd taken Paula's side without knowing a single fact, because Paula was better at telling the story first. And a surprising number of people who simply found the whole thing awkward and chose, as people do, to be somewhere else. Here is who stayed. Exactly one person, and I hadn't seen it coming. Her name was Cassandra Okafor, and she cut hair. She had a 2-chair salon on Broad Street called Sharp Cassandra, which was a pun she'd never once apologized for. And I'd been going to her for 6 years because she was the only person in Providence who understood that a woman with my kind of hair did not want a style. She wanted it out of her face and off her neck so it didn't catch in a machine and scalp her. Cassandra was 51, born in Lagos, raised in Cranston, widowed young, and possessed of a bluntness that I had come to depend on, the way you depend on a level to tell you the floor is lying. I went in for a cut about a week after the flatbed took the Mazak, and I must have looked like something scraped off a boot, because Cassandra put down her scissors, and she didn't ask what was wrong. She went to the little fridge in the back and came out with 2 cans of Fanta and sat me down and said, "Talk." And I talked. The whole thing, in a rush, the way you only tell the truth to someone who isn't inside it. And when I got to the part about the will, about Paula being executor, Cassandra held up one finger. She had a way of holding up one finger that stopped traffic. And she said, "Wait, you've seen this will?" I said I hadn't. Paula had shown me a page, the signature page. Cassandra set down her Fanta with a click. "You watched your father's whole company get sold by your sister on the strength of a page you were shown across a table," she said, "by a woman who benefited from what was on it." She let that sit. "Gwen, I love you, but you have to stop being a person things happen to." I want to tell you that lit a fire in me right then. It didn't. What it did was smaller and more important. It made me feel, for the first time in 3 months, like a person with a spine instead of a person with a schedule. I didn't act on it for a while, but it went in like a splinter and it didn't come out. The floor of it, the actual bottom, came the following winter, and it did not announce itself with a crisis. It announced itself with a Tuesday. I had taken a job at a shop in East Providence called Trident Tool, running a manual lathe for $22 an hour, which was a step down, and everyone knew it, including me. The owner was a decent man named Sal Petrosian, who ran a tight, unglamorous operation making fixtures for the boat building trade. And the work was fine, and the pay was fine, and I was grateful for it. But one Tuesday in February, I clocked in at 6:30 in the dark, and I clocked out at 3 in the dark. And I sat in my car in the lot with the engine running for the heat, and I realized I could not remember the last thing I had genuinely looked forward to. Not dreaded, not endured, looked forward to. I couldn't find one. That's the floor, not the crying, the blankness. The discovery that grief and humiliation had quietly repossessed the part of you that wants things. What kept me going was so small I'm almost embarrassed to say it. It was a windowsill. I lived then in the top half of a 2-family on Doyle Avenue, and the kitchen window faced east. And on that windowsill, I had a jade plant that my father had given me in a coffee can in 1998, a cutting off a plant his own mother had kept alive through a depression and a war. It was not a sentimental object between us. Dad had shoved it at me and said, "It's impossible to kill, so even you can't," which was his way of saying he loved me. That jade plant had outlived him now. And every morning, that terrible winter, I watered it a little. A jade plant barely wants watering, so this was mostly ceremony. And I turned it a quarter turn toward the light so it wouldn't grow crooked reaching for the window. And that quarter turn was, some days, the only deliberate act of care I performed for anything, myself included. You keep one thing alive on purpose, and it turns out you're still in there. The first real step back was so unglamorous I nearly missed that it was a step. Sal Petrosian caught me one afternoon in the spring reading a manual on my lunch break. Not a machining manual, a book about probate law I'd gotten from the Providence Community Library, because Cassandra's splinter had finally started to itch, and I wanted to understand the machinery of what had been done to me the way I understood the machinery of a lathe. Sal looked at the cover and he said, "My cousin Ara's a paralegal. You want? I'll ask her to look at your thing for a beer and a favor." I said I couldn't afford it. Sal said, "I said a beer, Gwen. You buy the beer." Ara Petrosian was 34 and worked for an estate firm in Warwick and had the specific, unshakable calm of a person who read documents for a living and was no longer impressed by anyone's confidence. We met at a diner called the Seaplane in East Providence, and I bought her a beer and a plate of fries, and she read the copy of the will I'd finally, belatedly, requested from the probate court. Because that's the thing nobody tells you. The will is a public record once it's filed, and I could have simply gone and gotten it any time, and hadn't, because I'd trusted the page my sister showed me. Ara read it slowly, twice, with the fries going cold, and then she looked up and said the sentence that changed my life. "Gwen," she said, "your sister was the executor. That part's true. But she wasn't the majority beneficiary. This splits the residual estate 50-50. And there's a durable power of attorney in the file, executed by your father in 2016, that names you, not Paula, as his agent for all financial and business decisions in the event of incapacity." I said I didn't understand what that meant. Ara said, "It means for the last 2 years of his life, when his memory was going, when the big decisions were getting made about that company, legally, the person with authority over Fletcher Precision's finances was you. Did anyone ever tell you that?" Nobody had ever told me that. And I sat in the Seaplane diner with a paralegal I'd known for 40 minutes, and I felt the floor of the last year and a half of my life tilt very slightly, the way a boat tilts when someone you didn't know was aboard walks to the other rail. I have to slow down here because the temptation is to make what came next fast and satisfying, and it wasn't. It was 2 years of grinding, careful, unglamorous work. And I want to be honest about the length of it, because that length is the whole point. Here is what I did not do. I did not call Paula. I did not call a lawyer and scream about a lawsuit I couldn't fund. I did not do anything, for a while, except learn. I learned that a power of attorney dies with the person. it doesn't reach past death, so it couldn't undo the sale directly. That felt, for about a week, like a wall. But Ara, who had by now stopped charging me in beers and started, quietly, treating me like a project she believed in, explained the more interesting thing. She said, the POA doesn't reverse the sale, but it's a thread. If your father's business decisions in his last 2 years were legally supposed to run through you, and instead your sister was quietly steering the ship toward that sale the whole time, positioning it, undervaluing it, cozying up to Meridian before he was even cold, then the sale wasn't just fast, it might have been engineered. And an executor who engineers a sale to benefit herself, in breach of her duty, in a 50-50 estate, Gwen, that's not a family disagreement. That's a fiduciary breach. That leaves a paper trail. Paper trail. I'd heard the phrase my whole life without ever having one aimed in my favor. It took 18 months to build it, and I built most of it myself, at the kitchen table under the jade plant, because I couldn't pay someone to do the hours, and because, it turned out, I was good at it. A machinist is a person who is comfortable with tolerances, with the idea that 1/1000th of an inch is the difference between a part that works and a part that's scrap. I brought that to the documents. I requested everything I was entitled to, and a few things I wasn't sure I was entitled to, but asked for anyway, in a firm, polite letter, which Ara taught me works more often than it has any right to. Bank records, the Meridian purchase agreement, Paula's emails with Douglas Reyes and with Meridian's acquisitions man, which came out through a records request tied to the probate accounting she'd filed sloppily, because Paula, for all her camel coats, had never once in her life imagined being audited by me. And the picture that assembled itself, tolerance by tolerance, was this. Paula had approached Meridian 11 months before our father died. She had commissioned a valuation from a firm that shared an owner with Meridian's real estate arm. She had, while our father's mind was softening, taken him to re-sign estate documents at Douglas Reyes's office. Documents that, conveniently, no longer mentioned the 2016 power of attorney and tried to name her sole executor with broad discretion. She had, in short, spent the last year of a dying man's life quietly rearranging the locks. I did not feel triumph assembling this. I want to be clear about that, because the stories always get this part wrong. I felt sick. Every document was another small proof that the person who ran alongside my bicycle had, at the end, decided our father was an asset and I was an obstacle. The long climb had its setbacks, and I owe you the true ones. The valuation firm's records were sealed, and it took Ara 4 months and a friend of hers named Marcus to find a legitimate way to the same numbers through a different filing. There was a stretch of 9 months where the whole thing stalled because I ran out of money to cover even the filing fees, and I picked up Saturday shifts at Trident, and Sal Petrosian pretended not to notice I was there for the money and started, without a word about it, sending me home on Fridays with the extra from the shop's lunch order, which was not extra, which he bought on purpose, a fact we both understood and never once discussed. That is a kind of decency I have never forgotten and never will. And Cassandra, God, Cassandra, when I hit the wall of not being able to afford a real attorney to take the thing across the finish line, because Ara was a paralegal and could build the case, but couldn't stand up in a courtroom or write the letter that would land, it was Cassandra who fixed it, in the way she fixed everything, sideways. One of her salon clients of 15 years was a woman named Renata Bott, a semi-retired litigator who came in every 3 weeks for a blowout and complained about being bored. Cassandra, cutting Renata's hair, told her my whole story with my permission, and Renata Bott listened to the entire thing in the mirror. And at the end she said, "Send her to me. I'll do it on contingency." I haven't been genuinely angry about anything in 2 years, and I'd like to be. I met Renata Bott in her home office in Barrington, a room full of sailing photographs and a golden retriever named Chief Justice, and she read my 18 months of work in 90 minutes. And when she finished, she took off her glasses and said, "You built this yourself?" I said, "Mostly." She said, "Gwen, I have paid associates $200 an hour to build worse. This is airtight. There are no angles left in it." And then she said the thing that told me she was the right person. "We're not going to sue for the company. The company's gone, chopped up, it's not coming back, and chasing it will cost you your life. We're going to sue Paula for what she took from you personally by breaching her duty. That's cleaner, it's provable, and it's the number that'll actually land." The number, when Renata ran it, was substantial. Between the undervaluation, the shop had been worth closer to $1.4 million than the $890,000 it sold for, and my half of the difference, and the executor's cut Paula had taken that a 50-50 estate never entitled her to, and the interest over what by then was 4 years, the figure came to something north of $310,000 owed to me. Renata thought we'd settle for $240. I told her I didn't care about the number. She said, "I know, that's why you'll get it." Somewhere in the 4th year, without my quite noticing when, I stopped being a person things happened to. I made shop foreman at Trident. Sal gave me the keys, literally handed me a ring of keys to the building, and said, "You've been running this place in your head for 2 years. Might as well get paid for it," and bumped me to salary, $68,000, then $74,000. I started night classes at CCRI and business management, sitting in a fluorescent room with people half my age. And I was, to my own surprise, the one who understood the case studies fastest, because I'd lived one. I bought, with money I'd saved shift by shift and with the clarity of someone who'd learned exactly what a small industrial building was worth and what it wasn't, a rundown commercial property on Water Street in a coastal town called Wickford in North Kingstown. A nothing little brick building, 2,200 square feet, that a retiring locksmith sold me for $140,000 because I paid in cash and asked no favors and closed in 3 weeks. I didn't know when I bought it what it was for. I just knew it was mine, that no executor and no camel coat could reach it, and that it faced the harbor, and that my father would have run his hand along the brick and said something dismissive that meant he approved. The jade plant came with me to Wickford. It sat on the sill of the new place, which I'd started fixing up on weekends, and it was by then nearly 3 feet across, a genuine small tree, and it had thrown a second generation of cuttings that I'd rooted in coffee cans and given away, to Cassandra, to Ara, to Sal's cousin, to a woman at CCRI who'd admired it. Impossible to kill, even by me. Paula resurfaced in the 5th year, and she did it exactly the way you'd expect a woman like Paula to do it. Through paperwork, sideways, believing I was still on the floor where she'd left me. She sent a letter, not to me, to Renata, once Renata had filed, and the letter was pure Paula. It didn't apologize, and it didn't panic. It called my claim an unfortunate misunderstanding driven by grief, and offered to resolve the family matter privately for a payment to me of $30,000 in exchange for a full release to avoid the expense and unpleasantness of litigation which serves no one. Nothing personal, just what makes sense. Renata read it to me over the phone, and I could hear her enjoying it. "She thinks you're the same person," Renata said. "She thinks you'll take $30,000 and feel lucky. This is the most useful letter she could have written, by the way. It's an admission she'd rather pay than go to discovery." Then Renata, who had gotten what she wanted, which was to be genuinely angry about something, said, "Gwen, it's your call. I can push this to a courtroom and we'll win bigger, and it'll cost you 2 more years of your life and your sister's name in the newspaper. Or we settle at a number that makes you whole and lets you keep your life. What do you want?" I thought about it for exactly 1 night at the kitchen table under the jade plant in Wickford, with the harbor going pewter and then dark outside the window. I did not want Paula in a newspaper. That surprised me, but it was true. Some part of me still remembered the bicycle. What I wanted was simpler and harder to explain. I wanted the record set straight in a room where it couldn't be spun, and then I wanted to never think about her again. I wanted my number, the real one, not her insulting one, and I wanted it acknowledged that she had done what she had done, on paper, with a lawyer present, so that it existed in the world as a fact and not as her version. I called Renata in the morning and told her, no courtroom, no newspaper, but no discount either. $240, as she'd first said, and Paula sits across a table while it's laid out, all of it, so she has to hear it in full. That was the price, not the money, the hearing of it. The room where the balance finally righted itself was a bank office, and I want to tell it exactly because it did not go the way these things are supposed to go, and the way it actually went was better. It was the Washington Trust Branch on Brown Street in Wickford, the coastal town where I now lived. In a conference room, they let Renata book because Renata banked there, and because a bank conference room is neutral ground and quieter than a lawyer's office. It was a bright, ordinary Wednesday in October. The harbor was full of the last sailboats of the season through the window, and the room had a plate of grocery store cookies that nobody touched, and a carafe of coffee that everybody used as a thing to hold. Paula came in a different coat, 5 years on, a gray wool one, and she'd aged, we both had. And she came with Douglas Reyes, still in French cuffs, older, less certain. She sat down across the table and did the thing I'd known she would do, the thing she'd done in the shop 11 years before. She started talking first. She said this was all so unnecessary, that we were sisters, that Dad would be heartbroken to see us like this, that she'd only ever tried to do the responsible thing in an impossible situation, and she resented being made a villain for it. I let her finish. Then I looked at Renata Bott and I said, "Would you read it, please?" And Renata read it. Not a speech, a record. She read in a flat, professional voice the timeline I had built with my own hands at a kitchen table over 18 months. The date Paula first contacted Meridian, 11 months before our father died. The valuation firm and its shared ownership with Meridian's real estate arm. The re-signed estate documents that had quietly disappeared the 2016 power of attorney naming me. The $1.4 million comparable sales that made the $890,000 price a gift to the buyer. The executor's cut, a 50-50 estate, never permitted. Each item with its document number, its date, its source in the probate file. It took 11 minutes. Renata read it the way you'd read a machine's tolerances off a spec sheet, without heat, because heat wasn't necessary and its absence was worse. Paula's face held its color, her eyes stayed dry, and her posture never once gave way. That is not who Paula is, and I would be lying to make her collapse for the shape of the story. What she did was retreat, item by item, into the only country she had ever really lived in. She said, executors are permitted broad discretion. She said, the valuation was performed by a licensed firm. She said when Renata reached the power of attorney, that document was superseded. And Renata said, mildly, it was removed. There's a difference, and the removal is time-stamped, and your father's neurologist notes from that same month are also time-stamped. And for the first time in the 11 years I had been dealing with my sister, Paula stopped talking for a full 10 seconds. Then she looked at me, not at Renata, at me. And she said in the flat, institutional voice I would know in my grave, "It was never personal, Gwen. It was a business decision. You were never going to run that company." And I understood, finally, that she believed it. That was the thing I'd been chasing for 11 years without knowing it. Not an apology, which she would never give, but the simple confirmation that she had genuinely converted our father and our childhood and me into line items, and felt to this day that this made her the reasonable one. It should have hurt more than it did. Instead, I felt something closer to release, the way a bolt that's been seized for years finally turns. Not a triumph, just the quiet, mechanical fact of a thing that had been stuck, coming loose. I said the only thing I had to say. I said, "You're right that I was never going to run it, Paula. You made sure of that. But you were wrong about what I'd do instead." And then I let Renata finish the paperwork, because the words were done and the numbers were the last thing left. Paula signed for $240,000, paid over 18 months, secured, no appeals, a full mutual release. Douglas Reyes slid the pages across, and Paula signed them one at a time with a Washington Trust pen from the cup on the table. And I watched her do it, and I felt no urge to say anything else. The balance simply moved from one side of the ledger to the other, the way balances do when the account is finally reconciled. And then it was over, and the sailboats were still out there in the window, and nobody had raised their voice once. One more thing happened in that room, and it's the thing I actually carry. As we filed out, the bank's branch manager, a young man named Tobias Aldana, who couldn't have been 30, who'd only booked us the room and had no idea what had gone on inside it, held the door and said to me and me alone, because I must have looked like whatever I looked like, "Long meeting. Can I get you a fresh coffee before you drive?" And I said, "No, thank you." And he said, "You sure? It's a hell of a view from the second floor if you want a minute." And I don't know what he saw, but I took the minute. I stood at the second floor window of a bank in a town I'd chosen and looked at a harbor I now lived on and let myself have exactly 60 seconds of it before I went back to my life. A small kindness from a stranger who never knew what it landed on. I've thought about Tobias Aldana more than I've thought about my sister since. Here is the part with the building, because you're owed the small justice, even though it arrived quietly and by accident. 2 years after the bank, Blue Harbor Health, a growing outfit that ran physical therapy and occupational clinics up and down the Rhode Island coast, was looking to open a location in Wickford, and their real estate scout wanted a certain 2,200 square foot brick building on Water Street, right on the harbor, with the good bones and the parking. That building was mine. I'd fixed it up over 5 years of weekends, and I leased the ground floor to Blue Harbor on a 10-year commercial lease at a rate that made my accountant, a sensible woman named Priya, laugh out loud with pleasure. And the regional manager who signed that lease on Blue Harbor's behalf, whose name was on the paperwork that came across my desk, was a woman I'd never met named Ingrid Solberg. And Ingrid Solberg's second in command, the operations lead who'd actually be running the Wickford clinic day to day, the person whose office would be on the ground floor of my building, paying rent to me on the first of every month for 10 years, was my sister Paula. She'd landed there after Meridian's money ran through her fingers, the way money does when you were never good at anything but taking it. I found out the way I found out everything now, by reading the paperwork carefully. I sat with it a long time. And then I signed the lease, because it was a good lease and a fair one, and I am, in the end, my father's daughter and not my sister's. And refusing a legitimate tenant to make a point is exactly the kind of small, personal, spiteful move that Paula would have made, and I would not. Paula rents from me now. She has for 3 years. We do not speak of it. On the first of the month, her company's payment clears into an account with Fletcher on it, because I named my little property company Fletcher Holdings. And I like to think our father approves, in his dismissive way, of the name being back over a door on a harbor. The justice of it is quiet, and it is not the point, and it happened to me more than I made it happen. I did not build a life to punish her. I built a life, and the punishment turned out to be a small tenant paying rent inside it, which is the most it deserved. The life I built is not spectacular, and I would not trade 1 hour of it. I run Trident Tool now. Sal Petrosian retired 4 years ago and sold me the shop on terms so generous they were practically a gift, 40% below what it was worth. Because you already ran it, and I'd rather it stay a place than become a number, which is the closest thing to a philosophy I've ever heard him express. I have 19 employees. I bought back a used Mazak lathe 2 years ago at auction, not the one from my father's floor. I looked. That one had been scrapped in Carolina years before. But the same model, the same green. And when I run a part on it, I sometimes talk to it under my breath, the way Dad did. And my youngest machinist, a 24-year-old named Deshawn, who is better than I was at his age, has stopped thinking that's strange. I still get my hair cut by Cassandra Okafor every 3 weeks at Sharp Cassandra on Broad Street, and I still pay for it, even though she's tried a dozen times to wave me off, because you do not stop paying the person who fixed your life when they could have just fixed your hair. Ara Petrosian passed the bar last year at 41, and I flew to her swearing in and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself in over a decade. The good kind, the kind that means something is finally full instead of empty. Renata Bott and I have dinner twice a year, and she still keeps a photograph of that airtight timeline in a drawer because, she says, it's the best pro bono she ever did. And I let her keep believing it was pro bono, even though I paid her the day the settlement cleared, in full, plus a bottle of Macallan and the golden retriever's weight in dog biscuits. Last month I had the two of them over, Cassandra and Ada, to the house I bought on the water in Wickford, a small gray-shingled thing with a kitchen window that faces east. The jade plant sits on that sill now, my father's jade plant, a small tree that has outlived him by 16 years and outlived everything that was done to me and will, at the rate it's going, outlive me too. I'd made a mess of a dinner and Cassandra had fixed it, because Cassandra fixes everything. And we sat at my table while the harbor went pewter and then dark, and Ada noticed the plant and asked about it, and I told her. And Cassandra, who had heard the whole thing years ago over 2 cans of Fanta, who had put her one finger up and told me to stop being a person things happen to, reached over and turned the jade plant a quarter turn toward the window so it wouldn't grow crooked reaching for the light, without being asked. The way you do a thing in a house you've decided is partly yours. There, she said. Now it grows straight. I didn't tell her that I turn it every morning, that I have for 16 years, that it was the one thing I kept alive on purpose during the winter I nearly disappeared. I just let her think she'd fixed it. It was the least I could do for the woman who actually had.